When travelers found the Morgan cabin in late May of 1843, they discovered two children, sisters aged 10 and 7, still alive inside, still waiting for their parents to return from a supply trip that should have taken 3 days, but that had stretched into 3 months, still maintaining the routines their mother had taught them for surviving alone, and still believing that spring would bring their parents home, despite the fact that spring had already arrived weeks earlier, and despite the increasingly obvious truth that no one was coming back for them. The children had survived the entire winter alone, through careful rationing and through rigid adherence to the survival instructions they had been given. But they had survived into a spring they could not recognize as spring because they were waiting for a specific version of spring that included their parents' return. And when that return did not occur, they simply continued waiting inside the cabin where they had been told to stay, choosing to trust instructions over evidence and to maintain hope over acknowledgement that the wait had become permanent. Welcome to this journey through one of the most heartbreaking demonstrations of children's trust ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when parents sometimes had to leave children alone for brief periods while traveling for supplies or conducting business that children could not accompany, when survival instructions given to children had to be clear and absolute, because deviation could mean death, when stay inside until we return was understood by parents to mean stay for the reasonable duration of the errand, but was understood by children to mean stay until parents literally walked back through the door, regardless of how long that took. There lived two sisters who were left with instructions to wait, and who waited with such perfect obedience that they waited past the point when waiting made sense, past the point when spring indicated change had come, and past the point when their survival had transformed from temporary self-sufficiency into permanent abandonment that they could not acknowledge, because acknowledgement would require disobeying the instruction to wait. That was the last thing their mother had told them to do. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between trust and the kind of obedience that becomes its own form of imprisonment. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that cabin and watch children wait through months for parents who will never return, consider what it meant to leave children alone on the frontier and why such separations required absolute trust between parents and children. Trust that instructions would be followed exactly because deviation could be fatal. Parents who had to travel knew that children left behind needed clear rules that would keep them safe. Stay inside where warmth and food were located. Don't wander outside where getting lost or injured was possible. Wait for return rather than attempting to follow or to seek help. Children who followed these instructions survived brief separations and were reunited with parents as expected. Children who violated instructions risked dying from exposure or from getting lost in terrain that offered no mercy to those who wandered unprepared. But the system assumed that separations would be brief, that parents would return within the promised time frame, or within reasonable extension of that time frame, and that children's obedience to waiting instructions would not be tested beyond the limits of what childhood patience and childhood understanding could sustain. The system did not account for what would happen if parents never returned, if the wait extended from days into weeks, into months, if spring arrived without bringing the reunion that children had been promised, would come when weather improved. The system assumed adult return, assumed that waiting would end, assumed that trust would be validated, rather than becoming the mechanism that kept children confined long past the point when confinement served any purpose beyond obeying instructions that had lost their protective function once the parents who gave those instructions were gone. The Morgan family, David, age 41, Caroline, age 37, and their two daughters, Sarah, age 10, and Emma, age 7, lived on a homestead approximately 15 miles northeast of what would eventually become Rolla, Missouri. They had been on the property since 1839, had survived 3 previous winters, and were considered by their sparse community of neighbors to be a stable family who managed their affairs competently and who showed the resilience that frontier life required. In late February 1843, David and Caroline made the decision to travel to the nearest substantial settlement to obtain supplies that could not be produced on the homestead: salt, metal tools, fabric, items that required purchase rather than manufacture. The settlement was approximately 40 miles distant, a journey that in good weather could be completed in 3 days round trip, 1 day to travel there, 1 day to conduct business and prepare for return, 1 day to travel back. But late February weather was unpredictable, and the journey carried risks that travel in spring or fall would not carry. David and Caroline debated whether to take the children with them or to leave them at the homestead. Taking them would mean slower travel, would require managing children through potentially difficult weather, and would expose them to the same risks that the adults would face. Leaving them would mean 3 days of the children being alone, but would allow faster travel and would keep them in the familiar environment of the cabin where they knew how to manage fire and food and where they would be safe as long as they stayed inside and followed instructions. Caroline spent the morning before departure giving Sarah and Emma detailed instructions for the 3 days they would be alone. The cabin was well stocked with firewood and food. The children knew how to maintain the fire in the stove, knew how to prepare simple meals, and knew the boundaries of safety that must not be violated. Caroline's instructions were clear and absolute. Stay inside the cabin. Do not go outside except briefly to get firewood from the stack immediately beside the door. Do not wander away from the cabin. Maintain the fire. Eat regularly from the supplies that were laid out for them. And most importantly, wait for Mother and Father to return. We will be back in 3 days, Caroline told them. Wait here. Stay safe, and we will return. Sarah, at 10 years old, was considered responsible enough to care for her younger sister for 3 days. Emma, at 7, was old enough to understand and follow instructions. The parents were confident that the girls could manage the brief separation, that 3 days was well within the range of what frontier children were expected to handle, and that the risk of leaving them was smaller than the risk of taking them on a winter journey through terrain that could become dangerous if weather turned bad. David and Caroline left on February 26, 1843. The weather was cold but clear, suggesting that the journey would be manageable and that return would occur as planned within 3 days. By March 1st, the parents would be back, the children would be fine, and the brief separation would be merely another demonstration of frontier self-sufficiency that families practiced routinely. But David and Caroline Morgan never returned to their cabin. What happened to them was never definitively determined, but the most likely explanation was that they encountered severe weather during their return journey, that conditions deteriorated rapidly in ways that made travel impossible, and that they died from exposure somewhere between the settlement and their homestead, their bodies lost in terrain that was difficult to search, and that would not give up its dead until circumstances allowed systematic searching that never occurred. The children, of course, knew nothing of this. They knew only that Mother and Father had left on February 26th and had said they would return in 3 days, and that 3 days passed without return, and then more days passed, and then weeks passed, and the children continued to wait inside the cabin as instructed, continued to maintain fire and eat from diminishing supplies, and continued to trust that the instructions they had been given, stay inside, wait for return, were instructions that would eventually be validated by parents walking through the door. The winter of 1843 was harsh, with cold that persisted well into March, and with weather that would have made travel dangerous or impossible for much of the time after David and Caroline's departure. This meant that even if the children had recognized that something was wrong, even if they had decided to violate their instructions and attempt to seek help, the weather would have made such attempts nearly suicidal for two children traveling alone through winter conditions in terrain where the nearest neighbors were several miles distant and where getting lost or frozen would be easy and getting found would be difficult. So the children waited. Sarah, as the older sister, took responsibility for maintaining routines. She managed the fire carefully, making the firewood last longer than it should have by burning only what was necessary to prevent freezing. She rationed the food supplies, giving herself and Emma smaller portions than they wanted, understanding that making food last was more important than eating enough to feel satisfied. She kept Emma occupied with the small tasks and activities that cabin life allowed, trying to maintain normality and trying to suppress her own growing fear that mother and father were not coming back as promised. Emma, younger and less capable of understanding the implications of extended absence, asked repeatedly when mother and father would return. Sarah told her what mother had said. They would return when they finished their business. They would come back as soon as they could. The children just needed to wait and stay safe. Sarah repeated these reassurances to Emma and to herself, trying to maintain belief that the wait was temporary, even as days became weeks and weeks stretched toward months. March passed without return. The children's supplies continued to deplete despite rationing. Firewood that should have lasted 3 days had been stretched through 3 weeks and was now running low. Food that should have been adequate for 3 days of 2 children eating normally had been made to last through rationing that left both girls constantly hungry, but that prevented complete starvation. The cabin remained their world. They did not violate the instruction to stay inside, did not attempt to seek help, did not try to determine what had happened to their parents, but simply continued waiting as instructed. April came, bringing the first signs that winter was moderating. Temperatures rose, snow began to melt, and the world outside the cabin showed evidence that spring was arriving. But the children had been told to wait for their parents' return, not to wait for spring, and the changing season did not alter their adherence to instructions. They continued to stay inside, continued to maintain their increasingly desperate routines, continued to wait for the specific event, parents walking through the door, that would end their wait and validate their obedience. By early May, the children were in crisis. Their firewood was nearly exhausted. They were burning final pieces and were facing the prospect of having no fire at all. Their food supplies were almost gone. They were eating minimal amounts and were showing signs of malnutrition and weakness. But more devastating than the physical deprivation was the psychological state that months of waiting had created. Sarah had moved from hope to resignation, from belief that parents would return to acceptance that something had gone wrong, but she could not bring herself to violate the instruction to wait, could not take Emma and attempt to leave the cabin to seek help, because doing so would be disobeying the last thing Mother had told them to do. Emma had become quiet and passive, had stopped asking when parents would return, had retreated into a state where she simply followed Sarah's lead and waited without understanding clearly what they were waiting for anymore, or why the wait continued when spring had come and when the 3 days Mother had promised had stretched into something that felt like forever. The travelers who found the Morgan children on May 22nd, 1843, nearly 3 months after David and Caroline had left, were passing through the area on their way to destinations further west and had decided to check the isolated cabin to see if anyone lived there who might be able to provide information about trails or conditions ahead. They approached the cabin and called out, expecting either no response if the cabin was abandoned, or normal response if a family lived there. What they heard was a child's voice, weak and hesitant, asking who was there and what they wanted. The travelers identified themselves and asked if the cabin's residents were well and needed any assistance. Sarah's voice came back through the closed door, saying that she and her sister were waiting for their parents to return and asking if the travelers had seen a man and woman traveling toward this area. The travelers, immediately concerned by the situation implied by a child's voice asking about missing parents, asked when the parents had left and when they were expected back. Sarah answered that they had left in late February and had said they would return in 3 days. But that 3 days had passed, and then many more days had passed, and the children had been waiting as instructed, but parents had not come back yet. The travelers, now alarmed, asked Sarah to open the door so they could help. Sarah hesitated, explaining that Mother had told her to stay inside and to not open the door to strangers, that she was supposed to wait for Mother and Father to return. The travelers assured her that they meant no harm, that they wanted to help, and that 3 months was far too long for children to be alone, and that something must have happened to her parents, and that she and her sister needed help immediately. Sarah, after long hesitation and after consultation with Emma that the travelers could hear through the door, finally opened the cabin door. The travelers saw immediately how dire the situation had become. The girls were thin, were showing obvious signs of prolonged malnutrition and stress, were dressed in clothes that had become too small or too worn during their months of waiting. The cabin was cold because fire had almost gone out, was nearly empty of supplies, and showed evidence of months of careful rationing and desperate conservation that had allowed the children to survive, but that had been consuming resources that had no way to be replenished while the children remained confined. The travelers gave the girls food and water, which Sarah and Emma consumed slowly and carefully, as if they were not sure whether eating freely was allowed. The travelers asked questions about what had happened, about when the parents had left and what instructions had been given, about how the children had survived for 3 months alone. Sarah explained the instructions. Stay inside, maintain fire, eat the food that was there, wait for return. She explained that she had followed these instructions as carefully as she could, that she had made the food and firewood last as long as possible, and that she and Emma had been waiting for the spring to bring their parents back, because Mother had said they would return when weather was better. The travelers gently explained that spring had already come, that it was late May, and that winter had ended weeks ago, and that if parents had not returned by now, then something serious must have prevented their return. Sarah seemed unable to fully process this information, seemed to be struggling with the conflict between the evidence that spring had come without bringing parents and the instruction to wait, that she had been following for 3 months, and that she did not know how to stop following. The travelers took the girls with them to the nearest settlement, where community members organized a search for David and Caroline Morgan. The search found evidence that the couple had reached the settlement in late February and had completed their business and had begun their return journey, but no trace of them was found along the route back to their homestead. The most likely conclusion was that they had died somewhere between the settlement and home, that weather or accident had claimed them, and that their bodies were lost in terrain that had no reason to give them up, and that had hidden them well enough that casual searching would not reveal them. Sarah and Emma were taken in by a family in the settlement who had no children of their own and who were willing to care for 2 orphaned girls. The girls adjusted slowly to their new life, but both bore psychological marks from their months of waiting. Sarah had nightmares about being alone in the cabin, about waiting for return that never came, about the moment when she realized that spring had arrived, but that arrival of spring did not mean arrival of parents. Emma remained quiet and passive for years, had difficulty trusting that adults who promised to return would actually return, and showed signs of the trauma that came from waiting through months when 7-year-old understanding could not comprehend why instructions to wait continued to apply when everything suggested that waiting no longer served any purpose. The Morgan cabin was eventually reclaimed by another family, but the story of the children who had waited through winter for parents who never returned became part of the region's collective memory, a reminder of how literal children's obedience could be, and how tragic the consequences when instructions given for brief separation had to be followed through months of abandonment that children could not acknowledge as abandonment, because acknowledging would mean disobeying the last words their mother had spoken to them. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most heartbreaking demonstrations of trust. 2 children who waited through 3 months of winter for parents who had said they would return in 3 days, who followed instructions so perfectly that they followed them past the point when following made sense, and who survived into a spring they could not recognize as the spring that should have brought their parents home, because they were waiting for a specific version of spring that included reunion rather than recognizing that spring had come and their parents had not. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where children wait and instructions become prisons, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between trust and obedience. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Morgan children's wait. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozarks, 2 children once waited through an entire winter for parents who had promised to return in 3 days, and that those children survived through perfect obedience to instructions that had been meant to protect them for a brief separation, but that became the mechanism that kept them confined through months of abandonment, waiting for a spring that came without bringing what spring was supposed to bring, trusting instructions past the point when trust served any purpose except to validate the last words their mother had spoken before walking out a door she would never walk back through.